What if I told you that part of your mind exists solely to operate under work environments and that you have no recollection of your entire life outside of work? That you exist solely to perform tasks and purposes that you'll never understand and that no matter what, you are forced to stay. In Apple TV's Severance, this nightmare becomes a reality. But beyond the silly premise, there is something we can all truly relate to in the show. A perfect visualization of what philosopher Karl Marx described as alienation 200 years ago. Today, I'm going to dive into how Apple TV's Severance uses Karl Marx's theory of alienation and turns it from an abstract concept to a visceral human reality. I'll show you how the show isn't just mindless entertainment, and it's actually the most literal concept of alienation ever produced on the television or film screen. Whether you're a fan of Severance or a fan of philosophy or just stuck in a mindless job, I feel like this analysis could be for you. So, without further ado, let me dive in.
Let's get this party started.
First, what is Karl Marx's theory of alienation and how does Severance illustrate it? Karl Marx's theory of alienation describes how workers tend to feel estranged from their humanity when working in capitalist societies. In Severance, this alienation isn't psychological as Marx describes, it is surgically enforced onto their employees. This show provides the perfect lens to understand all four theories of Marx's alienation. 1. Alienation from the product of labor. 2. Alienation from the actual production process. 3. Alienation from the quote-unquote species being, which is alienation from our human essence. And 4. Alienation from other humans. Let's explore how the show goes into all four theories of alienation within the dystopian Lumon workplace. 1. Alienation from the product. What are the employees at Lumon actually making? In traditional Marxist theory, workers and employees are often estranged and alienated from their products because they're not the ones who own them. They don't want the workers to be attached to the products because they're selling them off to someone else. In Severance, they take this concept of alienation from the product to the extreme. The MDR department quote-unquote sorts scary numbers all day, but we have no understanding of what that actually means, no understanding of what the numbers represent, no knowledge of the final product of all the numbers, no comprehension of how their work actually affects the real world, and no ownership of what they actually produce.
They were scary. The numbers were scary.
There's a literal scene where Dylan asks, "What do we do here?" And Mark simply responds, "We're refiners. We refine." This tautological explanation of their work highlights the true disconnection between them and their final output. Normal factory workers, although they can't buy the products they produce in most cases like cars or clothes, they can at least see and feel them. Lumon severed employees exist in the state of epistemological alienation. Their work is so abstracted they can't even describe what they're doing or why. 2. Alienation from production. In other words, when your work becomes your entire existence. For Marx, alienation from production occurs when your work becomes this forced, external, repetitive role, instead of this fulfilling creative activity that you actually want to produce. In Severance, this alienation is taken to extremes once again, as they're literally imprisoned. The innies experience several forms of confinement. 1. Spatial confinement. They can't even leave their workplace ever, without the okay from their outies, of course. 2. Existential limitation. They can't live and dream beyond what their workplace tells them.
Do you have a family?
You'll never know.
3. Temporal totality. They're constrained to this clock that they can't control at all. They only exist when their outies let them exist.
I am a person. You are not.
And 4. Procedural absurdity. They perform tasks based on how numbers feel. They can't describe or form any connection with their work. The severed workers don't just work at Lumon. They only exist at Lumon. They have no concept of life outside of the office walls. They literally can't go outside. When Helly attempts to commit suicide, this is the most extreme case of Marx's alienation of production. She would rather no existence than existence of filled, forced produced labor. 3. Alienation from our human essence. the actual surgical concept of being severed. From a sci-fi standpoint, the most profound concept in Severance is the literal severing of the consciousness. This is the ultimate form of alienation from what Marx calls the species being. In other words, our essential human essence, what makes us us. The creative, social part of us that makes us individual. The severance procedure creates workers who are alienated from their history and identity, their friendships and relationships, their all creative work and all individual activities that they do, and essentially all context that proves one's existence and humanity. When our beloved Irving discovers his Audi lives a life full of creativity with his paintings, you can see the literal alienation form on his face as he realizes his creative identity has been surgically removed from his work cell. Alienation is even more tragic when you realize the innies instinctively realize they're missing something from themselves. For example, when Innie Dillon wakes up at his home and he realizes he has a kid, in fact he says, "I have a fucking kid and I don't get to see him," Innie Dillon realizes that what makes him human has been surgically cut from him in order to make him a more efficient worker. 4. Alienation from others. Corporate division by design. Marx's fourth concept of alienation comes from the idea of strategically separating humans from other beings. In capitalism, for example, social relationships evolve into what are called market relationships, where the concept of competition is more paramount than traditional cooperation. In Severance, Lumon deliberately manufactures division and separation through departmental segregation. Workers are physically separated from one another.
Optics and design.
Back with that refinement.
Induced paranoia. Workers are taught to live in fear of one another.
You don't trust your guys.
You, the king of fucks, don't trust us.
I do.
But people just talk about MDR. Stupid old stories, jokes even.
Regulated interaction. Social interactions like Burton Irving are strictly monitored. And prohibited fraternization. Relationships in the severed office are strictly forbidden.
The Lumon manual doesn't say anything about lip-to-lip contact. It does discourage romantic fraternization.
The quote-unquote perpetuity wing in Severance, where you pray and bow down to the Lord and Savior Keir Egan, fosters this corporate dogma. The 4 quote-unquote tempers that Keir advertises in his mythology are separated, just like the workers on the severed floor. The corporate Panopticon, aka surveillance and self-policing. Building on Marx's theory of alienation is Michael Foucault's concept of the Panopticon, which helps us understand how Lumon maintains control over its severed employees. In Severance, surveillance takes multiple forms in the Lumon office. There's physical surveillance with cameras and other monitoring equipment. There's also psychological surveillance, which takes the form in the break room scenes we've seen before, where they psychologically torture the employees. But also there's self-surveillance, where the innies are put in this position to police themselves, because otherwise their outies might disapprove. When Dillon, for example, gains temporary consciousness and discovers he has a son, Dillon enters what Foucault would call bifurcated panopticon, which essentially means Dillon's outie self is now the jailer and the judge of his innie self. His innie self must live with the consequences his outie self influences. The surveillance literally extends to their most intimate possessions, their actual bodies. Their innies are consistently alienated by their outie bodies as they become temporarily vessels occupied only between the working hours, and otherwise their bodies are left for someone else to control. But at the same time, there's also resistance through community on the severed floor. The innies are finding humanity in the connections they make. Their rebellion doesn't occur through traditional labor reformations like protests, but it comes through finding their humanity in between the connections with each other. For example, on the severed floor, rebellion comes through building relationships with one another, like Burton Irving's relationship in season 1. It also comes through sharing information with one another, as we've seen many times the innies share information with one another, which reveals new things about the office. Even creating almost arbitrary meaning, like what Dillon does with his perks and pencil erasers, is also a form of rebellion.
Feeling attacked?
All this comes together to sort of assert the innie's identity. Through work and through these efforts, small efforts of rebellion, they discover who they really are. When Marx tells Helly, we're not just livestock, we're people, this is Marx fundamentally putting his foot down and asking for personhood and recognition, that he's more than just a laborer, that he actually has an identity and it has a human essence. The break room. Ideological reprogramming and the total control of psychological alienation. The break room scenes represent arguably the most disturbing aspects of Marx's theory of alienation. When Helly is forced to repeat, "I am sorry for the trouble I have caused," over and over until she genuinely feels it, we are literally witnessing a form of alienation from your own emotions and a complete lack of moral autonomy. The idea of alienation from one's own emotions goes further than what Marx ever talked about in Alienation and touches on Marx's successors. The idea of repressive sublimation is the channeling of desires into forms to reinforce control, aka like manipulating one's desires. The point is, Lumon doesn't just want its employees' labor, they want its complete psychological submission. Severance shows us that the dreaded final frontier of capitalism isn't just the complete commodification of labor, but it's the commodification of consciousness itself. The Audis don't just sell their time or their skills, they're literally selling fragments of their existence to Lumon. When Dylan tells the team, we're not just parts of the whole, we are the whole, he is rejecting the commodification of consciousness. He asserts that the innies are not just tiny fragments of a person meant for labor, and that they are a whole thing in themselves, and that this whole thing they are deserves agency and determinism. Severance, the ultimate question of personhood under capitalism. The brilliance of Severance lies in how it turns abstract Marxist theory into visceral human drama. By literalizing alienation through the physical severance procedure, the show forces us to confront fundamental questions about humanity, like our identities and whether we're free. In season 1, when Helly desperately pleads to her Audi to let her go and that she's a free person, we are seeing the most essential struggle against alienation in all of its forms. It isn't just a laborer asking for better working conditions. It's a consciousness demanding the right to exist beyond labor and utility in general. All in all, in our increasingly fragmented and work-divided world, the show Severance reminds us that this 175-year-old theory of alienation by Marx is eerily present today. The show reminds us to question these systems that treat human beings more as resources to be optimized than people to be truly fulfilled. If you're curious of more philosophical concepts or cultural analysis in general, subscribe to BM for more.